Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the BlazeSports webinar. We'll get going in just a few minutes, so hang tight. Good morning and welcome to the BlazeSports 2018 Fall Webinar Series, a deeper dive into adaptive sports and recreation. This free three-part series has been made possible by a grant from the Craig H Neilsen Foundation. We thank them for their assistance on this project. This series will focus on people with three major physical disabilities: spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, and limb loss or limb difference, and take a closer look into adaptive sports and recreation for each. Each webinar will feature two presenters, one disability-specific expert and one para-athlete or adaptive sports and recreation programming expert, in order to provide a well-rounded view of the topic. This webinar will be recorded and available for viewing after completion at www.blazesports.org. For Certified Adaptive Recreation and Sports Specialist holders, CARS, CEUs will be credited upon completion of the short survey at the end of this webinar. For more information on how you can become a Certified Adaptive Recreation and Sports Specialist, please visit the Training and Education page at blazesports.org. There will be time at the end of this webinar for questions from the audience. To submit a question, please use the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel to type your question. We will address as many questions as we can during the time provided. Any questions not addressed will be followed up with via email. Now it's time to officially kick off the final webinar of our series, a deeper dive into adaptive sports and recreation for people living with limb loss or limb difference. We are very excited to introduce our two speakers today, Dr. Jasmine Townsend and John Register. Dr. Jasmine Townsend is an assistant professor in recreational therapy within the Department of Parks, Recs, and Tourism Management at Clemson University, a faculty scholar in the School of Health Research, and the coordinator of the master's degree program in recreational therapy. Her primary research interests include investigating the outcomes of participation in recreation, sport, and leisure for individuals with disabilities. Her current research area focuses on the health outcome of recreational therapy for military service members and their families, and understanding the feasibility of incorporating competitive adaptive sports in university settings. Dr. Townsend is the past co-leader of the American Therapeutic Recreation Association Military/Veterans Treatment Network, serves as a co-leader for the Veterans Affairs section of the American Journal of Recreation Therapy, and is the associate editor of the Therapeutic Recreation Journal. Dr. Townsend's practical experience as a certified therapeutic recreation specialist include working in the community adaptive sports and therapeutic recreation programs, in wilderness and residential treatment programs for youth with behavioral and mental health conditions, and implementing international adaptive sports programming in countries like Indonesia, Mexico, and Thailand. John Register is a Gulf War Army veteran, a 4-time track and field All-American, and a 2-time Olympic trials qualifier who suffered a sports career-ending injury which resulted in the amputation of his left leg. During rehabilitation, John began swimming for cardiovascular fitness. And within only 18 short months of training, John qualified and made the 1996 Paralympic team in the 50-meter free and swam the anchor in the 4x400 medley relay. At the Games, John first saw other amputees running and jumping in track and field with prosthetics, and this led him to chase a new goal, competing in track and field. 4 years later, John achieved that goal and competed in track and field at the 2000 Paralympic Games in Sydney, Australia. Since his injury, John has advised 3 U.S. Secretaries of State on disability foreign policy, been featured on numerous television shows, including It's a Miracle, NBC Weekend Today Show, and MSBC's Morning Blend, and founded the United States Committee's Paralympic Sports Program, helping wounded, ill, and injured service members use sport as a tool for their rehabilitation. John also currently coaches high school hurdlers in track and field. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Townsend to get us started.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about amputation and adaptive sports for individuals with amputations, and so we'll just dive right into this. A quick definition of amputation, as you can see on the screen, refers to surgery to remove any or all parts of a limb due to injury, disease, or infection. Now, part of what this presentation about is loss of limbs, but also limb differences. And so in some situations, you can be born with an amputation or a limb difference, and that will be considered a congenital amputation to be born with it. Oftentimes, this results from something like the umbilical cord wrapping around an arm or a leg that then reduces the development in that limb. And so in some situations, somebody could be born with a shorter arm and a smaller hand, and that would still be considered a congenital amputation. A traumatic amputation, on the other hand, refers to a loss of limb in the field at that time of injury. And so this could be from a variety of reasons, but most predominantly happens due to car accidents. Oh. All right, so here's some numbers to go along with an understanding of how many people have amputations. So there's about 2 million Americans in the U.S. with amputations, and that amounts to about 185,000 amputations per year. More males than females are at risk of amputation. Non-white males are at higher risk, which is, 4 times higher, and above 65-year-olds is 3 times higher risk. And a lot of the reasons for this are related to health and lifestyle health conditions. So if you look over at the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that 70% of the causes of limb loss are due to disease. This is diabetes, PAD, PVD, these are vascular diseases, also in complications with diabetes, reduces blood flow to the extremities and causes a whole host of problems, but the vast majority of amputations are due to those diseases, and many of those are age-related and also lifestyle-related diseases. You'll see the other causes being trauma, car accidents, and for veterans, incidences in combat, and then birth defects and such kind of round out those last few. There's one missing on there. I think cancer. It's not showing up as my 4th little dot, but one of those 4% ones is cancer, I believe. So again, the vast majority of amputations are due to diseases. A few more little tidbits here of information. About half of individuals with an amputation due to PVD or PAD will die within 5 years. And again, this is mostly because many of the health conditions associated with amputations oftentimes result in amputations because they're unaddressed, they're unmedicated, and individuals are not changing their lifestyles with regards to food and exercise and such, and that usually causes further complications. More information on the age side of things of individuals with disability or diabetes with a lower leg amputation, about half, just over half, will require the amputation of their second leg within 2 to 3 years. So again, unmanaged generally leads to more complications over time and more amputations. Upper extremity amputations, interestingly, are usually caused by trauma. lower extremity amputations are usually caused by disease. So when we think about who we're serving in community, Parks and Rec or adaptive sports, wherever that may be, oftentimes we get this visual of younger people, veterans with amputations and such, but that's generally not the biggest proportion of who has an amputation. So I guess in understanding if that's all we see in our programs, we know that we're serving the smaller portion of the population. We have a much bigger population there with age-related amputations. So if we are to just get some basic information on what amputations are and how they're classified, they're broken down into from the upper extremity amputations above elbow and below elbow. And as you're looking at this graphic and all these percentages here, these percentages refer to the residual limb that's left over following the amputation. So if you look at that above elbow shoulder disarticulation, 0%. If you look at the picture, you'll see that goes right through the joint. That's and so the residual limb would be 0%. And as you work your way down the arm, you can see the different percentages that are left over. The goal in any amputation, doctors try to preserve as much residual limb as is possible so that there can be functional ability afterwards, whether with or without a prosthetic. And so to whatever degree is possible, they'll try to maintain some limb for that. Okay, good job. In the lower extremity amputations, we have 3 categories: hip amputations, above the knee and below the knee. There's a little bit less, the percentages are there, but as well, and that also refers to the residual limb left over. You can see the hip amputations are very severe and involved, and oftentimes can include portions or all of the pelvis. So that's, yes, very, very intense. And again, with the upper extremity, doctors also try to, with the lower extremity, doctors also try to preserve as much of a residual limb as possible for functional abilities afterwards. So some potential complications of amputations. This generally is in the more acute time setting right after the amputation occurs, but really any of this could happen at any point for somebody. Some common complications, including joint deformities and hematomas, which are a complicated word for bruises, infections, and wound openings. When it comes to the skin issues, that's one complication that could be present at any time from any point moving forward, and it's a very important one to keep in mind as we work with individuals with amputations. Deconditioning is one that builds up over time as individuals with amputations and along the lines with individuals with disabilities tend to be less active than individuals without amputations, and so they get out of shape, and then having to learn to get back into shape with a different body situation can lead to challenges there. Phantom sensations, which is still having sensation of the limb that's no longer there, and this can be sometimes very painful for some people and other times less so much. And then of course the psychosocial conditions. This would be present also at any time, and hopefully participation in adaptive sports can help address some of these things in regards to depression, anxiety, isolation, and even PTSD depending on the nature of the amputation. Those who are at highest risk for complications include mostly people with other health conditions. Some of these could have been the precursor to the amputation. Most of them are, some of them could come afterwards. Individuals with above the knee amputations also tend to be at higher risk for all of the other complications. So just information to keep in mind. We may not ever work with anybody with any of these issues, but it's always good to know that these are all possibilities at any point in somebody's life after sustaining an amputation. So what are some of the benefits? There are many, many benefits to participation in adaptive sports, and this is kind of across the board regardless of what your physical condition is. So I have it broken down into a couple groups here. Physical benefits include muscle strength and coordination, cardiopulmonary endurance, motor coordination, balance, gait, and again, these are really across the board benefits for anybody, even people without disabilities. Psychosocial and emotional benefits, a lot of adjustment and coping benefits here. When we talk about some of the complications that could come out of sustaining an amputation, like depression or anxiety, being involved and active in somebody's life can have huge benefits for their overall quality of life, but then very specifically with regards to mood, adjustment, integration with their peer groups, all of that is incredibly important to just overall functioning. Other benefits could include community reintegration, and isolation can be a big thing for a lot of people, with anybody with a disability to deal with, but especially in society that is not physically accessible or even attitudinally accessible. And so for some people, it's just easier to not have to deal with those barriers. And so isolation can be very big. And so adaptive sports serves as an opportunity to get people back out into their communities, and more importantly, to be active in their lives. So some important considerations to think about as a service provider, an adaptive sports service provider. As I mentioned before, the skin breakdown on the residual limb as individuals go through their participation in any activity that they're doing. It's important to understand their prosthetic and how it fits, and hopefully to some degree they already have that understanding. And I realize that I could be talking to a wide spread of service providers right now, so we all have varying levels of knowledge when it comes to prosthetics and the appropriate use of prosthetics. And if this is part of your role to help your clients understand which prosthetics are appropriate, which liners and all sorts of things, the fit, then that would be obviously part of what you do. Not everybody does that though, and so it is important for us to understand, but if there comes to be a time where your participant is complaining about how a prosthetic feels while they're participating, it might be time to recommend that they go to talk to a prosthetist or a medical doctor if they are having skin issues. If they have sensation and they can feel hot spots, it's really important that they tell you about those hot spots so that it can be addressed before it turns into a sore that would be challenging to manage. Again, there's a lot of things to consider with prosthetics, and they're so technologically advanced and getting advanced more and more as time goes on. A lot of people come in with their own ideas about how they want to use their prosthetics. I've been to a couple of adaptive CrossFit competitions and seen people coming in with things that they made in their garage to use to lift weights. And you know, that could be very beneficial, but that wouldn't be something that I would have a lot of knowledge about how to modify or anything. So I think a discussion about prosthetics is incredibly important before we ever start a client in an activity. And whether that has to happen with a prosthetist or a PT, that might be an important kind of group conversation about that. I think it's also important to examine somebody's fitness level prior to participation. As I mentioned before, deconditioning is something that does happen for a number of people with amputations, especially if it takes a while for them to get back into activity. And just like anybody who is out of shape, we wouldn't want to throw them into participation without gauging first their ability to participate safely. There is some information out there in the world, in the literature, that talks about the energy consumption of individuals with amputations, and that as the amputations have become more severe, so whether it's a bilateral above the knee or progressing, that they consume more energy in their participation in recreation and leisure. But there's conflicting information that says that they don't. And so, but as I was reading this literature, I came to the understanding that because it takes people's bodies a while to adjust to prosthetics and adjust to their new movement, that's what's causing their energy consumption levels to be higher. And so as we're asking people to participate in our activities, I do think that we have to keep this in consideration, especially if we're working with people who are a little bit more out of shape, that we give them time for breaks and really gauge their fitness and their energy during our activities, just so that we can accommodate for whatever their needs are there. With regards to special needs prior to participating, whether it's on-site or before they get there, I don't know that there's anything necessarily that's an absolute requirement just because somebody has an amputation, but it may always be a good idea to have a medical evaluation depending on what they're asking to participate in. it's always vital to do an assessment for functional abilities. And so for all the equipment that we need and understanding what their strengths are, their physical strengths and areas where they may be weaker so that we can be aware of those things. This is a vital step that is before they start participating in anything needs to happen. If you're working with somebody who's interested in moving to the competitive level, there does need to be a detailed evaluation of whatever the limb deficiency is and any impairments. And this really speaks more to classification and determining what groups they would participate in there. Also, part of that would be to gain an understanding of their prosthetic and what equipment needs are there as well. And then sport specific, I didn't feel like there was anything that needed to be really called out specific to any sport. It really just came down to the skin breakdown and everything that I was, all the information I was gathering, that seems to be one of the biggest challenges for a lot of individuals with amputations in whatever they do, especially in sport, is making sure that their skin within the prosthetic device stays healthy. So in regards to all the different activities that are available out there, pretty much anything you want to do. So I just threw some pictures up there. I tried to group things between entry level and competitive level, but really it's all pretty much the same. There are so many opportunities for individuals with amputations to participate in any sport. And there is a growing number of those that are merging into competitive level, some at the Team USA level and others in more, general competition. And so there are just many, many opportunities. Some of them require the use of prosthetics, others don't. And in some situations, there are already prosthetic devices that are suited for those activities. And as I mentioned with the CrossFit, other times people are coming up with their own tools to get through those activities. And so to be aware of what all the options are and all of the accommodations that can be made to the activity and with the equipment is important to understand there. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. And last, with the adaptive sports and recreation, again, there's nothing here that is really super sports specific or amputation specific. I mean, I would really hesitate to say that an amputation could limit anybody in any activity that they would want to do, because there are so many pieces of equipment that can be modified or created in order to allow somebody to participate. So in my experience working in a number of adaptive sports organizations, I've seen people do pretty much anything they've wanted to do. And so one thing that we talk about in recreational therapy, like with our students as we're teaching them, is we have to get creative sometimes with the equipment. And we joke about having duct tape and PVC pipe and padding in our toolkits everywhere we go. And in some cases, that's what we need to make things work. But in other cases, there's very specialized equipment that works very well for getting anybody active in any activity that they're interested in doing. And I think that's it for my section.
Hey, it's John. Thanks so much, Jazz. What a great introduction and presentation that you just did. I hope everybody's learning as much as I am learning on this webinar. Thanks, BlazeSports, for putting this out in this Institute for Adaptive Sports and Recreation. Really appreciate the webinar series and appreciate being on this call. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. Because that's just what I do. I'm a storyteller, so everything that Jasmine said, I agree with, and there are some things that I'm going to say right now that hot spots are real, they're a real thing, and skin breakdown is real as well. So just be very considerate of the patients that you're working with, the client that you're working with, as you move forward in whatever recreation activity they want to do. Inside the community group part of this presentation, I want to talk about, why we're in this business. Are there other organizations that are already doing this business, and how are you going to dispose of the business? I got that information because I was in a class that was talking about how to run a business. And the most important question to ask yourself in running a business is, how are you going to dispose of the business? And I think also how you get into it. So for me, my whole attitude and perspective shifted when I was at the Paralympic Games in 1996 in Atlanta. I was watching closed circuit television. I was a swimmer, and I was watching closed circuit television to a long jumper over in the Olympic Stadium. And as this long jumper was on the runway, the camera zoomed in on him, and he was running leg over leg down the long jump runway with an artificial leg above the knee amputation, like myself. I had never seen a person run before or run on a prosthetic before. And this person had to take off going left into the air. And at the apex, the height of his flight, this artificial leg flew off. And I had never seen this before. And he hit the sand. His artificial leg landed about 3 feet up in front of him. The entire crowd went dead silent, like Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone, put his hands on their faces, the big open mouth. And the long jumper then turned back to the official and said, hey, man, so where are you going to measure my jump from? From right here where I landed or where my artificial leg landed? And I cracked up and thought that was the most amazing attitude to have about what goes on in the world of prosthetics. And that shifted my perspective to let me think, why am I in the swimming pool over here at the Paralympic Games when I really should be on the track and going back to one of the All-American honors I had while at the University of Arkansas? And so that's shift in perspective really opened my eyes up to this entire world of disability sport. And the first thing I began thinking about when I joined the United States Olympic Committee was I saw organizations out there and trying to understand why they were actually in the business that they were in. And so I think the why is very important, because what I began looking at the first youth camp or youth sports national championship I went to, I was trying to do this kumbaya, let's all come together. And the organizer of that that event actually got up and walked out of the presentation. And I said, I have a whole lot to learn because I don't even know why these people aren't even listening to. We should all come together and do this. So I found out that a lot of mom and pop organizations were springing up because their child had a disability. And what began happening was these organizations began to become siloed in their production of these sports. So there could be an organization right across and down the street from them doing the exact same programming, and both organizations were fighting over the same athlete to come join their program and increase their numbers. And so I began to ask the question of why are you doing what you're doing? Why is it that you're providing these services? Is it that you are this organization and you want to spring up because it's the right thing to do? Are there other organizations that are around as you do the business? So we can go to the next one. Are there other organizations already doing the business? So we go to the next slide. So with, the thing about disposing of the business is this puts us in the right mindset of why we're doing it in the first place. And I would subscribe to you that it's not sport for the sake of sport, because sports, even though it can be for a lifetime, and I continue to enjoy sport even after I've retired, what happens is, even if you're looking at Olympic sport or any sport in general, the transition from sport to something else is what really trips people up. So sports generally becomes a conduit to that next thing. And I believe that next thing is a job. We need to be looking at how we're doing this as a job. So if you go on to the next slide to how we're doing to dispose of the business, the job really is rooted in attitudinal barriers. These attitudinal barriers are the dependence of other individuals, of how the society perceives that individual with the disability. So what do I mean? The focus really should be on the independence of the individual. And I believe in that final state, like I said, of employment. When you look at the American with Disabilities Act, it was founded in 1990, signed into law by George H.W. Bush. The unemployment rate at that time was about 73% for people with disabilities. Then you have all of these physical barriers that have been overcome, and the attitudinal barriers still continue to lag. And if you look at the cartoon or read the cartoon, I think it's kind of pretty funny. But that's so true that, when we want your opinion, we're going to tell you what that is. So we find more and more individuals that are doing these sports and being the caretakers of the sport that do not have a disability. And so we have to help people to become more empowered to be those individuals that can, like what I'm doing right now. I'm a hurdles coach. There are not that many people with disabilities running hurdles. So I can be empowered to still live life to a fully and active state of existence. We fast forward to the ADA now and see where we're at. The unemployment rate has gone down a whopping 0.5 to 1%. About 72% of people that are actively able to work actually have a job. Sports, maybe you talked about this in the last webinar, of people that are using wheelchairs actually goes down 30%, or however you want to say it, or raises up 30%. Because when you are actively involved and engaged, you have more confidence. That confidence around a group of individuals that are not going to say that I'm going to be less than or less capable, I'm going to be empowered, helps individuals get employment later on. And so look at what I'd say, the things that you want to do, that you need to do to overcome these attitudinal barriers. A lot of times we will place on other people what we believe they can or cannot do, which is based upon what we believe we could or could not do if we were the person with a disability. The physical barriers, I think, are equally challenging. Even though with amputations, I think we are in a category that is the least disabled of the disability community groups. We do have things that we need to consider, which I'll talk about in a minute, of barriers to overcome when it comes down to travel and equipment. So you see the polling station here. This guy wants to go vote, and guess what? He can't vote because the steps are going up, and we have this looks like this ramp that's going up, and he can get up this ramp. Of course, he can't do it. So we have all these physical barriers. So think about a physical barrier that might be in an environment of a track and field environment, for example. What would you do if a person puts on their prosthetics, and their prosthetics now have spikes on the bottom of them, and they have to walk across a concrete surface to get to track and field area? Is there a slip hazard that's there? So those are some of the physical barriers that amputees have to look at as we are trying to be more active, involved in sport. So as we move through the presentation, in Paralympic sports, I don't really think that people realize just how many sports there are in Paralympic movement that can be done. So there are 19 summer sports, these 6 winter sports that are going on in the community that amputees can be engaged with. When you look at this picture up here, you see that all of these individuals have amputations. They are either limb loss, limb difference, whether congenital or were had limb loss by trauma. They are all using some type of sport to get back to a healthy and active lifestyle. And you can see that all these sports are adaptable. So then what becomes our framework and our mindset to be in this area to become more actively engaged? Let's go on to the next one. I'll show you all the sports that are there, with archery all the way to volleyball. The point I want to make about this is your organization doesn't necessarily have to lend itself to a summer or winter sport for someone to be successful in. Most of the military sport programs that are successful right now are winter sports athletes who have come out of San Antonio and Brooke Army Medical Center. Not a whole lot of snow in San Antonio, but the biathletes, cross-country skiers that are military, the sled hockey team, a lot of them got their start by those programs that were started in San Antonio. And they moved them back and forth through to areas in which they could participate at a higher level. And I think what makes them so successful is because they didn't look at what was available to me in my community, even though you can do that, but they looked at what the person wanted to do and accomplish, because that was going to be the driving force. So when I tell athletes and share with them what sports should they be thinking about, if they're looking for a higher level of athleticism inside of Paralympic sports, I ask them to look at what their first primary sport is that they want to do, and if that's not something they think they can do, what's the secondary one they can do after that. The winter sport considerations. Winter sports are coming up. We just had the games in Pyeongchang, South Korea. And the prosthetic devices that are coming out, developed by some of the folks in the industry, are really changing the game for people to ask questions about, is the prosthetic device now superseding or being better than an able-bodied device? And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit in a minute. So let's talk about some of the space requirements inside of what your sports might have to happen. So I'm a track and field guy, so I'm gonna talk about track and field first. One of the things that I noticed quickly, going from an able-bodied athlete into a person with a disability with a prosthetic, was changing areas. Because taking my leg out, my leg is now a part of me like a shoe is a part of me. I need some special considerations. And my son, John Jr., was one of the individuals that actually shared with me and saw when he was like 6 or 7 years old that I needed to have some other considerations. So, for example, when I had my prosthetic lying out in the on the grass when I was warming up, just kind of walking around the track, he actually took, at like 6 or 7 years old, took my leg and wrapped a towel around it so that the sun wouldn't beat down on it. Therefore, when I put my leg in it, my leg wouldn't get a hot spot because it was hot on the inside of the leg. As I was saying earlier, removal of trip hazards. Oftentimes, we're not looking at what's on the track, and the little inside rail, usually on every track, on the inside lane, can be a trip hazard, especially for a double leg amputee trying to get over, definitely for those that are using wheelchairs to get over. And the surface is often not a consideration, because when I was just walking as an able-bodied athlete, I just walk across the different surfaces and I wouldn't even think about it. But now with a spike on and a prosthetic, that trip hazard becomes more pronounced. When you're looking at the circumduction, I saw a lot of athletes tripping and falling in races because they're circumducting. That means the legs are swinging out as they're running, especially with bilateral amputees. And they were running out, the leg would swing outside of the white line of the lane that they were in. It would hit with inside the lane, but on the foot strike, but the legs were swinging outside the lanes. So you have to have some considerations when you're putting the people next to other individuals, because you could have some circumducting that's going on before that person knows how to actually use the prosthetic more correctly and be more in alignment. Some of the medical concerns I saw when I was kind of preparing this presentation was, on-site prosthetics or prosthetists for competitions, I think is critical, because you never know what's going to happen. And just like an individual who's this an able-bodied athlete wants to have some medical attention there in case they need a rub down or something, a cramp happens, you don't know what's going to go on with a prosthetic. And you don't want an athlete missing a competition just because something broke on their limb. It could be fixed pretty quickly. It's amazing what duct tape can do to get things going, like Jasmine was saying. And offsite prosthetics for on call, like if you're having a camp, is also a good idea. So when I was having camps here at the United States Olympic Committee, I had a local prosthetist that I had on call. So in case something happened or broke, we could get that person in. I always kept with me some moleskin and some talcum powder, just so that if I got sweaty, I could put the talcum powder on, take the leg off, wipe the leg out from the inside. But if I had some skin breakdown, I could put some moleskin on real quick and I could continue the workout. And then some coaching requirements. I think coaches are coaches, and coaches can figure it out. Anybody that's a level 1, level 2, level 3 coach can figure out how to work with the person who's wearing a prosthetic, whether it's an upper extremity or lower extremity. all we have to do is just modify the activities and modify the warm-up, what I call the tune-up, to get the body in tune to do the activity for the day. No matter if that's cycling or whatever those sports I listed earlier, we have to be able to just adapt the activity so that the athlete is ready and prepared to do the activity. Any additional educational resources for coaches for this population is within side of technique. Prosthetists, just because they're prosthetists, does not mean that they know how to fit a running leg. I want to be very clear about that. I had to go through several prosthetists who knew how to align a walking leg, but did not know how to align a running leg. This is important because if you're using a prosthetist that's only primarily fitting geriatrics or those with diabetes and doesn't really understand how to fit a running leg, as the athlete begins to run faster and faster or do the activity, they could be out of alignment and therefore hurting their body structure, their body frame work. So you need to get to a person that understands biomechanics to the degree that they can actually align a prosthetist for whatever the activity is. When you're looking at the maximal allowable height, or what's called a MASH, this is something that's coming in really quickly now. And I would say for coaches and for administrators, begin measuring your athletes and their body types and shapes with a certified doctor, because this is coming out to show value, the proof for Paralympics of the actual natural growth of a person, instead of them trying to figure that out later. We can talk about that in the question and answer section. And then modifications, definitely for dynamic stretching, modify your cool downs, and your working out. The next one is athletes, I think, need to know how to answer or be advocates for what they need. As I said, I had to, not knowing what I didn't know, had to understand how I needed to align my prosthetist, my prosthetic. And I needed to go out and actually look at other athletes running and who were doing it at the highest level to see what I needed to do for mine. So I went to a prosthetist that was out in California who actually got it and understood it. Because just because the person becomes an amputee doesn't really mean that they're an expert in being an amputee. There's a lot that they have to learn. And to get around individuals that have amputation, that's the fastest way to actually learn of what somebody else might be doing to overcome some type of a deficiency that they were having and that they overcame it. So setting an inclusive environment. This is, for me, I don't make a difference between those individuals that have disabilities and those that do not. I want them all training out there together because their energy systems are pretty much the same, a little bit different for those that are using spinal cord injuries, but the workout and the work ethic is still the same. So we want to keep like environments together. And then the coaching expertise, coaches, like I said, coaches coach. So we just need to get coaches to understand the modification of what they can do and then challenge them to make the modifications to elevate that group. The athletic peer group, keep groups together, I think, by age where at all possible, because those individuals are going to move up the ecosystem and the eco ladder together. And it doesn't matter if they have a disability or not. Non-disabled and the impaired classes need, I believe, to be together. They learn one from each other, and they can see just what proper alignment needs to be. And then what amputations to look for and adapt. Those are the things I think they need to look for in an adaptive sports program. So how to ask the right questions. One of the things is these individuals with disabilities primarily are trying to look at a sport interest. And now it's starting to become a little more prevalent in that they can look at Paralympic sport and they can start seeing some of their heroes and some role models, but that doesn't happen at the lower levels in the grade schools, community schools. So what I say to do is to look at what everybody else is doing in the area and try to get with your ecosystem, your peer group, and see what they're doing and see where you can fit in if that's a sport that you would like to do. Look for an organization that's already fulfilling that need. You don't have to create an adaptive sports program just because the kids have a physical disability. try to integrate them in as much as possible, because then you're comparing apples and apples, and just all you're doing is adapting the sport. Just like we said in that first slide, that a lot of times mom and pop organizations will come up and they will have a child that has a disability, and they want that individual to have access to programs, but they build a program and create a silo for that athlete. What if that athlete no longer wants to participate in sport? Then what happens to the organization? That's usually one of the first questions I have. I much would have a person that's coming in an organization that is doing it just because they see opportunity and they're collaborative, than just creating another siloed organization. So traditional or adaptive, it really doesn't matter. I want more up towards the traditional style of that everybody plays together, because that's what kids want to do. They all want to be part of the same system, and kids get it. They'll figure it out. It's usually, like I said, with attitudinal barriers. What we do, we forecast on other people what we believe they should or should not be doing, or could not be doing, based upon what we think we would do or could not do if we were in their situation. So let kids be kids, let kids play. So some of the competitions that are out there are a lot more than these. I just named several off the top of my head, with Endeavor Games, which is now in 2 locations, Indianapolis, Turnstone Center, and then of course in Oklahoma City, right outside at UCO, University of Central Oklahoma, in Edmond. The Angel City Games is coming up, run out there by Clayton Freck, Disabled Sports USA, just changed over in leadership. They have winter sports primarily, but they do have a summer sport, a lot of summer sports that are going on now, and Desert Challenge. Those are just some of the areas in which we can get involved with. And then some of the other resources that I'm showing you there. I think I started earlier with like a 30,000 foot level oversight, and you see some of the other resources. One of which I want to bring, or two of which I want to bring your attention to, are the Amputee Coalition, because the Amputee Coalition can answer a lot of questions for amputees. They have a really good conference that comes up every year. I would strongly encourage, that it's going to be in San Antonio next year, strongly encourage, if you do have limb loss, limb deficiency, any type of impairment that has this category we're talking about today, get down to that conference. There are 1,100 amputees that take over a hotel, and you're going to find your answers there. The other one is the AAPD, the American Association for People with Disabilities. I serve on their board of directors, and there are a lot of great wealth of resources that are out there that are outside of the disability, the disability sporting community, that can help when I talk about getting those transitional phases. So they have, because of the sports, you can get jobs because of it. So I'm always high on that kick of employment, of what comes after this. So those are my comments for today. Like the guy with the artificial leg who couldn't keep it on in a long jump, I hope this changed your perspective a little bit on how you can keep your legs on, if you have legs or arms, and change your perspective to create an elevated sense of heightened awareness and activity for those living with limb loss, limb deficiencies. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jasmine and John. So we have a few more resources that we put up on here that we've been mentioning throughout the presentation. This is just a quick list. It's by no means exhaustive. But here you've got a couple of the big disability sport organizations: Adaptive Sports USA, Disabled Sports USA, U.S. Paralympic Sport Club, and BlazeSports. All of these have great resources, from starting a program to coaching specific to consideration and help for athletes along the way. Also, there's some great links, and all of these are hyperlinks. So we'll post the actual presentation and the recorded presentation in the webinar, but you'll be able to use these hyperlinks to just go straight to those sites. You don't have to search them. So on the Paralympic side, for other resources, you've got there are 4 major links. So the Gateway, get connected to a coach, start competing, and then the Coach's Corner, which are all great places to start if you are an athlete, and then definitely if you're a coach as well. And then you've also got sport specific by level of impairment. It's a great kind of resource chart to have for disability sport there. One second. There we go. All right, so I'd like to move, before we end our presentation, I'd like to move to Q&A at this time and open the floor for questions for Jasmine and John. Just real quick, some things that we've had come up throughout the presentation. One was from a participant that said they learned in the scuba diving world, that an old dry suit seal made of rubber or silicone greatly reduces any friction on the limb. So if you're looking for kind of a DIY very quickly, that can be great. Also, just remember another comment was, we haven't mentioned the ability of thermal regulation concerns in amputees. So because the blood is not taking the longer path because of the lack or shortened of limb, it's harder for them to cool. So just another consideration is helping to cool for sure with amputees. That can be another concern. If you have any other questions, you can go ahead and type them in the question box at this time. Looks like we just had one come in for Jasmine and John. Where would you start if you were just getting started for a program? Do you recommend that you start inclusive? John kind of led a little bit into that. Where would you start? So you're looking to start an adaptive sports program specifically for those with limb loss. Where would you start?
You want me to jump in on that one?
Sure.
Okay, so I would definitely start small and where you actually where there might be another program in existence. For example, if I'm going to start a cycling program, I'm going to go down the street to my local cycling shop and find out who are the enthusiasts that are in cycling, and find out who they know that have these has this type of disability. And then I'm going to expand from there to see inside this community, can we get a ride together for people with disabilities alongside of the individuals who do not. Triathlon has done this exceptionally well. All of their competitions are integrated with people with disabilities and those that do not have people with disabilities. So I would start that's where I would start. I wouldn't try to build a program specifically for the amputee community at first.
Can I add to this comment?
Absolutely.
So I also think it's important to talk to potential participants and see what they want, because everybody adjusts to an amputation at different stages and rates and such. And so some people might want to be off the bat, I'm okay to participate with anybody, but other people might want to be in situations where they would rather participate only with other amputees. And while that might not be like the most kind of intuitive way to go about developing a program, especially because that does change like the resources and the investment of resources into developing a program, I think it's important to put the participants' perspective into whatever considerations are going into program development. And maybe that means that you have some inclusive activities and some specific to just amputees activities, and whatever you're able to do in your facility and accommodate would be the way to go. But I think that's an important piece to understand what our participants want before we just kind of make a unilateral decision to throw out a program one way or the other and force them to participate in that because that's all they've got.
Excellent. Thank you both. Next question. The best avenue, it looks like they're asking, the best avenue to start to reach potential participants. So you have an existing adaptive sports program, but you're looking to specifically gear your program towards those with limb loss or limb difference. What are some avenues to reach out to these potential participants to get them involved?
I'll start if you want. I think this is where we have to get really creative. And if we're talking about a community-based adaptive sport organization, it's having relationships with healthcare providers around finding your recreational therapists and wherever they work and having them help share the information about your program. If you are working in a setting where you are in the healthcare setting and you're working with people who are early in their stages of recovery, the participants might come to you more easily because they are kind of a captive audience if they're still in an inpatient recovery. And while they may not be participating in adaptive sports soon after an amputation because they're still recovering and the limb is still recovering and healing, that's a prime time to go and plant the seed about participation in adaptive sports and helping to connect them with resources in their communities. Now, then, like I said, on the flip side, if you're already out in the community and it's maintaining those relationships with the other entities that work with these individuals at their various life stages. So that's one way. I mean, having a fully functional website is always great, but people don't always know what to search for in those situations, and so that can't be the only way to go about doing it. Adaptive sports or Facebook pages and Twitter and Instagram seem to be such a growing method of getting information out there because it's such a visual thing, and it's very can be very visually pleasing to see pictures of people doing such amazing things, and you stumble across that and then feel like that's something that you can do because you saw this cool picture type of a thing. And so I think it's a multifaceted approach to get the information out and let people know about what we're doing. We can't just take a single path to letting people know what's available.
I agree with Jasmine on that. The other thing I would like to just to add on to it is about likability to likability. And what I have noticed since 2004 to now, when I visit military hospitals, what I find is if I go and talk to a unilateral above knee amputee, I have a much better rapport with that individual than I do with a double leg amputee. And so I have strategically began using individuals that have the likability, whereas possible, to talk with that next individual. And what happens is the transition from what Jasmine was talking about earlier to back into a societal aspect of the other question I was asked on going into, where would you start? That gets people back into society faster, I found, than the isolation, because there becomes this downward or this stagnation of sustainability, and I think sustainability is bad because we don't want to sustain anything. We always want to be pressing and growing and pushing and stretching the individual. That's why I think it's really important to get these amputees to the Amputee Coalition meeting, because they're around a like group that are all over the map, and wherever you are, you can always progress to the next level. If you're just sustained, you have a tough time moving forward. So getting likability to likability, I think, is also critical. So Amputee Coalition, getting with rec therapists, military hospitals, all these points of injuries where points of injury are happening, get folks in there and then get them to understand your program. You will have a problem with HIPAA if you're going into hospitals, but you can get around that if you are in that by having a check mark on the box that's saying that they want your information. That's how I got around with Paralympics. And so the patient could then check the box, and then I could get all their information because they wanted more information about the programs I was offering.
Ooh, let me unmute myself. Perfect. So we have time for one more question. And the question that I have for you guys is, real quick, what about adaptive gyms? As a disabled veteran with a degenerative foot condition, I love the winter programs, but it seems that fitness areas lacking that aren't physical therapy related. How to start a gym for an adaptive community that actually takes their needs into account for fitness?
This is a great question. This is actually something that I'm working on here with a bunch of students of mine who are very interested in adaptive fitness. And I've had the opportunity to connect with a couple of organizations that do adaptive CrossFit. So CrossFit for individuals with disabilities. And it doesn't have to be like the, crazy CrossFit competition, but just fitness to be in shape. So in case you guys are unaware, and I'm advocating here for, or not necessarily advocating, but just providing information on one area because this is what I know better than anything else. But like CrossFit, the Mothership has come out with an adaptive CrossFit certification for all their level 1 trainers. It's voluntary at this point, but hopefully as it grows and spreads that more and more trainers will just do it anyways as part of their level 1 training to be a CrossFit coach. And what that means is that if you were to join a CrossFit box and somebody there has that certification, they are able to work with an individual with a disability in that CrossFit setting. So they can adapt movements for you. They can help individuals, just get fit, all within the context of how CrossFit does it. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to just your standard like Gold's Gym or 24-Hour Fitness, but there are other inclusive fitness certifications that are available, but that go along with like the general athletic training or type of certifications, but also voluntary. Doesn't mean that any of those gyms would have one or many people with those certifications. So to start a gym, I think would be incredibly challenging because that takes, as does anything, a lot of resources in terms of money and equipment and all that stuff to get something like that up and moving. But there are entities that are expanding what they offer to be able to have a more inclusive approach to working with individuals in their fitness needs, and that includes individuals with disabilities. And so I would encourage you to look for that. There's also an organization called the Crossroads Adaptive Athletic Alliance, CAAA. And they also work with CrossFit to help get information out to certified trainers about doing assessments, fitness assessments on individuals with disabilities, so that when that person shows up in your gym, you understand to some degree what their needs are, and that you can do an appropriate assessment to help adapt the activities and such. And so just a couple of resources there on the CrossFit side of things. But again, there's a lot of other opportunities for inclusive fitness certifications, but they are voluntary is my understanding at this point. So may or may not have anybody in a gym that's got one.
I agree with Dr. Jazz. I was going to say CrossFit too, so there you go.
Yeah, I love CrossFit. I'm crazy about it, but I know that not everybody is. But there is so much growth right now in the adaptive CrossFit area just for fitness levels, maintaining fitness levels and getting back in shape. So, but like I said, not everybody's into
CrossFit is like triathlon right now. It's growing, exploding, as well as, now you keep going back to jobs, and that is, you need to look at the Accenture study that just came out on the value of people with disabilities in the workplace. It's amazing.
Excellent. Thank you both. I see that we have one other question that came in about PFDs. I will directly reach out and send you an email addressing that question. So I'm going to go ahead and close us. On behalf of the BlazeSports Institute for Adaptive Sports and Recreation, I'd love to thank you for your participation in the final 2018 webinar. All of our resources will be included with the full presentation on our website for reference. Thank you to Jasmine and John for their time and effort on this project. You guys have been fantastic, as well as the Craig H Neilsen Foundation for their ongoing support. A quick survey will be linked to the end of this webinar. We look forward to the feedback that you give us on this presentation and directions if you would like to see something in the future, topics covered in webinars or podcasts. We hope that you guys will join us in the new year for our 2019 webinars. Thank you and have a fantastic day.